tell you of the detailed exploits of Buzz Lightyear, the delusional action figure from Toy Story who thinks he is a real hero, a real astronaut. We think of Buzz when we realize the enormous challenges NASA's facing, not the investigations, but that so-called vision thing, selling the idea that space is exciting, that those going into space are still rugged explorers doing dangerous things and important work, making sure that astronauts are thought of as heroes now for what they are doing, not just heroes when something bad happens. So who needs convincing the most? You may think it's the money people in Washington, but we think that's not really it. We think it's the kids who need convincing. Almost everyone in Congress now remembers the glory days of the space program. 20 years from now, many won't, and neither will the people who vote for them. So what'll it take to get kids to say on Halloween, Daddy, I want to dress up as astronaut Michael Anderson or Laurel Clark or Rick Husband or someone working here at the Johnson Space Center right now, tonight. Real heroes rather than pretend heroes like Buzz Lightyear. Not an easy task, but the future for the program seems to be demanding nothing less. It's worth noting, too, that Buzz seems to know he needs to keep his young owner interested, needs to stay in the coolest toy around category. He knows his survival in the toy chest depends on it. Buzz gets it. Hopefully NASA and the country will as well. But of course, the most pressing question in the short term is what went so wrong over the weekend, and we begin the whip with the latest on the investigation and CNN's Miles O'Brien. Miles, a headline from you tonight.
Aaron, NASA told us a little bit more about the final minutes of Columbia's fiery descent, and they also told us they aren't ruling anything out, but they're also operating on one assumption as well, that possibly some debris which fell off that external fuel tank on launch might have caused some serious damage to those insulating tiles.
Miles, thank you. Back to you at the top tonight. The President's budget was released today, and who would have expected that funding for NASA would get all the attention tonight? Senior White House correspondent John King has that. John, the headline.
Aaron, that budget was off the printing press well before Saturday's tragedy. Already, Mr. Bush was calling for a modest increase in the space shuttle program, most of that money to go to extending the life of the aging fleet. The big question tonight at the White House, will Columbia be replaced? The White House says the president cannot and will not answer that question until the investigation is complete. Aaron.
John, thank you. The search goes on for every small piece of Columbia that fell to the ground and some large pieces found as well. David Mattingly working that for us. David, a headline from you.
Hundreds of calls came in again today here in East Texas from people finding pieces of the space shuttle, but authorities say they're still missing some very important parts that they'd love to get their hands on. Also a warning tonight that some explosive material may have hit the ground here. Aaron?
David, thank you. And a quick turn to a very different sort of story tonight. The arrest of a music industry legend. Paul Verkaman is on that from Los Angeles. Paul, a headline from you.
Aaron, very different indeed. They might as well crank up the Calliope music, a media event here as Phil Spector is arrested on suspicion of murder after a woman is found shot to death in his estate. Aaron?
Well, thank you. Back to you, and all the rest shortly. Also coming up tonight on Newsnight, some terrific guests to go at the Columbia story, the tragedy, from a number of different angles. Congressman Sherwood Boehlert, who heads the House Science Committee, a committee that will look into the disaster. Easily one of the most respected journalists out there covering the space program and its history, Jeffrey Kluger, who's written the lead story this week in Time magazine, What Went Wrong, and one of the greats of broadcast news. We'll talk later in the hour to Bob Schieffer about Columbia, the presidency, and his life as a journalist. All of that in a very busy hour ahead from Houston tonight, but we begin with the investigation, and we continue to be struck by a couple of different things. First, NASA's effort to stay out in front, quickly share each new development as it comes along. And the second is how quickly things are unfolding, or at least seem to be unfolding. Columbia's nose cone was located today. It was discovered in Sabine County, where so much of the debris has fallen. How that fits into the larger picture, we don't yet know. But tonight, a working theory is taking shape. And if true, Columbia may have been doomed just a little more than a minute into its flight. We begin tonight again with CNN's Miles O'Brien.
Today, an even closer look at the area of Columbia drawing most attention as debris flies off the external fuel tank and strikes the underside of the left wing during the launch on January 16th. Shuttle Program Manager Ron Dittemore.
We're making the assumption from the start that the external tank was the root cause of the problem that lost Columbia. That's a fairly drastic assumption, and it's sobering.
Also today, home video possibly showing debris flying off the shuttle much farther west over San Francisco. NASA says data shows that temperatures on the shuttle were rising even before the shuttle reached the coast.
If we can get our hands on that piece of debris that really helps us indicate where the genesis of the problem is, that would be very important. If we find a piece of tile, each tile is individually coded. And if we find that tile and can decipher the code, we'll know exactly where it came from on the wing. And that's the missing link that we're trying to find.
Roger, roll, Columbia.
NASA clearly was concerned enough about the launch debris strike to study the problem, producing a memo estimating the size of any possible damage and concluding it would likely cause no burn-through and no safety of flight issue, a point echoed by Flight Director Leroy Kane during a briefing the day before landing.
Leroy, could you just review what the minor damage is to the tile on the left wing?
I believe that at this time we can't say with great detail the degree of the damage, other than all of the analysis suggests that it would be very minor in terms of the amount of tile that might actually be missing or had been removed, would be very minor. All of the analysis says that we have plenty of margin in those areas in that regard, but I can tell you we think it's going to be very small.
Now, of course, there is a lot of second-guessing about that engineering analysis, and it will be redone. But Shuttle Program Manager Ron Dittemore says he heard no reservations prior to Columbia's fiery descent.
I am aware, here 2 days later, that there have been some reservations expressed by certain individuals, and it goes back in time. And so we're reviewing those reservations again as part of our database. They weren't part of our playbook at the time because they didn't surface, they didn't come forward.
So the question tonight, Aaron, did they miss something big? A couple of other odds and ends that came out, among other things, that 32-second piece of data, which they were talking about yesterday, that might have been recoverable. They're not quite as optimistic tonight that they can get anything useful out of it.
Because?
Well, it's ratty. That's the term they use. Yeah. It's just sporadic stuff. It was when a vehicle was breaking up and things were coming down in an intermittent fashion. Of course, this is the best and brightest here. If anybody can get that data out of those ones and zeros in those computers, they can.
Let's go back to the problems on the launch. If they had studied it even more carefully, if they had identified the seriousness of the problem, would it have changed, could it have changed the outcome?
Well, there is one scenario that came up in that briefing today which is worth talking about. If they had absolute, definitive, conclusive proof that they had so many tiles taken off the bottom of Columbia that they knew the outcome, they knew they're going to lose the vehicle and crew on descent, they might have come up with a way of bringing the orbiter in a way that stressed one wing more than the other. In other words, kept the wing that was damaged cooler, made the other one hotter. Now, what that would do, that wouldn't get you to the landing site. That would lead you to an orbiter that would fail, but it could have gotten the crew down to a point where they could have bailed out. But you certainly would not have made that decision unless you knew for sure that was going to happen.
Miles, thank you. You'll be joining us tomorrow for the memorial service. The President will be here for that.
Sad day.
It is, and a long weekend. Thank you, Miles O'Brien.